Hi, this is Kara from the Special Needs Mom podcast.
And this is Angela from Especially Organized, Sensible Solutions for Special Needs Moms.
We have this heart for special needs moms. And so we thought, you know what, let's combine forces. And we have come up with what we're calling the Purge Party. And you can pretty much guess what it is. It's a party where we're going to come together and we're going to purge or, in general, accomplish a goal, a small goal together. So we have set this for January 27th, starting at 8 o'clock for my Pacific Coast people.
Which means 11 o'clock for all of you on the East Coast. So this is an opportunity. If you have something on your to-do list that has just been stuck there and you are wanting to move it up on the list, you're wanting to tackle, maybe it's a space or an area of your home or a category in your home that has just needed a little time and attention. This is your opportunity for you to be online with us while you work and have access for us to help you answer your questions, help guide you, and just serve you for those 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can tell like what we've designed is just this very high level of support for that project that you just haven't been able to tackle on your own. The thing that we are envisioning is that you get to leave this purge party feeling so accomplished because you did the thing. You started the year off getting that thing done that you were stuck on last year. And so it's a momentum builder, if you will. You can go ahead and sign up. We have a link ready for you. And we are offering this for $40 for the whole experience.
Absolutely. And we hope you'll join us. I think it's going to be really fun. It's going to be a great group of moms of special needs kids. So we all get each other. We all have an understanding of what it's like to have something on our to-do list, but just we haven't been able to tackle it yet. So I hope that you will join us. We're super excited to bring this to you, and we are thrilled to work with you.
All right. We'll see you all there. Hi, I'm Kara, life coach, wife, and mom to 4 incredible and unique children. It wasn't all that long ago that my son received a diagnosis that had my world come crashing down. I lacked the ability to see past the circumstances, which felt impossible, and the dreams I once had for my life and family felt destroyed. Fast forward past many years of surviving and not at all thriving, and you'll see a mom who trusts that she can handle anything that comes her way and has access to the power and confidence that once felt so lacking. I created the Special Needs Mom podcast to create connection and community with moms who find themselves feeling trapped and with no one who really understands. My intention is to spark the flare of possibility in your own life and rekindle your ability to dream. This isn't a podcast about your special needs child. This is a podcast about you. If you are a mom who feels anxious, alone, or stuck, then you are in the right place. Welcome. Hello and welcome to the Special Needs Mom podcast. It's been a hot minute since I have found myself behind the microphone. I did myself a little favor and I got pretty far ahead in my recordings and all the things so that my editor could be hard at work during the summer and I could be hard at play. And so it happened upon me a couple of days ago where she's like, hey, so how's those new episodes coming? And I still did have some in the queue, but what I did not have is the recorded introductions, sharing with y'all about, what's going to happen in this amazing interview that you're about to hear. So anyhow, I'm here and a little confession. And I'm like, oh gosh, this was recorded quite a long time ago. How am I going to refresh this little brain of mine to make sure I do this episode justice? And I did find notes and we're all in good shape. I will tell you more about our guests and our episode. But before I had that to fall back on, I thought to myself, okay, What's really interesting is I can so clearly recollect the experience that I had with being with Carrie, who was our guest on this episode. And the level of connection that I had with her during and after our interview. And honestly, we stopped recording and I think we continued talking for another good amount of minutes. I don't remember exactly how long, but I think it was one of those things where we talked about a lot of things, a lot of deep and meaningful things, and I will tell you about those in a second. But there's something about when you get to spend time with somebody and it's so meaningful. We see people all the time. I saw some friends at the beach today and it was super fun and, kind of cool to be able to hang out on the beach with people. But as you know, in those kinds of passings, especially when, you're chasing around kids, you don't always get to have the level of connection that I think us special needs moms really crave. So that's what you have to look forward in this episode. And let me tell you a little bit about Carrie. Carrie is a wife, a mother to 4, writer, speaker, and podcaster. I laughed out loud to myself when I read that. I was like, well, no wonder why I like her so much. She sounds kind of like me, minus the writing gig. Anywho, she's passionate about encouraging mothers of special needs children to identify, accept, and thrive in their journey. She also co-hosts the podcast Take Heart with Sarah Klein and Amy J. Brown, where their listeners find hope, joy, and connection. So you definitely want to check their podcast out. And let me tell you a little bit about Carrie's parenting experience. Her third of 4, her third son, was prenatally diagnosed with spina bifida and hydrocephalus. He had 2 life-saving surgeries and then a few weeks later went on to respiratory failure that sent him and the family to the emergency room. He spent the next 2 months fighting for his life. Came home medically fragile with a tracheostomy, ventilator, and feeding tube. Over the past 15 years, he's had 60 surgeries, and they've been in and out of the hospital with stent surgeries, rare worst-case scenarios, scoliosis surgeries, feeding issues, etc. He's been in physical and occupational and speech therapy almost since birth. He also uses a wheelchair full-time. Carrie mentions that giving up the dream of him being able to walk was really a challenge for her. We do go into that in the episode. He also has learning disabilities, and she homeschools all of these children. Her children are 19, 17, 15, and 12, 3 boys and 1 girl, also like my family. And she shares that she's also had the joys and pain of in-home nursing care for the past 15 years and its accompanying stressors. People in and out, adjusting, getting attached, and then them leaving. And I know this actually, I wanted to make sure I put this early in the episode to kind of tease y'all, because I know this comes up a lot. For those of you that have or are considering having in-home care, of all the complex dynamics that brings into your life, your home, and, obviously the benefits, but some of the cons and some of the really challenging things about that. So Carrie has a true expertise in this, and she does share really valuable pieces that I think will be immediately actionable and very helpful for everybody, because even if we don't have somebody living in our home, we do work closely with people to care for our children. And so I think you can use it to apply. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what I also remember from the episode now that I found my notes. So we talked a lot about story, and if you were a longtime listener, you will definitely have heard me talk about story and the value of story and why our story matters. And there is something truly it's deep and meaningful when actually you get to share your story and another person gets to just witness your story. And so we talk about that, and that actually, she shares early about kind of support groups and finding community. And I think this really, 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 really makes a difference in our lives as special needs moms. So have this be your weekly reminder to find your people. And part of me, when I say that, I'm like, oh gosh, I know. We're all hearing this. But I think that can look like little small actions where maybe you just send a message to somebody on Instagram or somebody that you know in your real life and send a little message saying, hey, thinking of you today. Or it's something where you say, hey, do you have a few minutes? I'd love to connect. Something simple like that. Okay, well, without further ado, let's get into the episode. Welcome, Carrie Holt. Well, welcome, Carrie, to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I know a little bit about you. I know that you're a fellow mom of 4, I know that you're awesome. And yet I don't know as much as I would like. So I would love for you to give us a quick picture of what your life looks like, especially as it relates to being the parent of your child who has special needs.
Sure. So my name is Carrie Holt, and I'm from Central Ohio in the Midwest. My husband and I have been married about 22 years or so. We have 4 kids. So our oldest is actually launching into college in August. And then we have a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 12-year-old. Our first 3 are boys. And then we had a girl tacked on the end, which was really fun. I became a special needs mom about 16 years ago. And I say 16 because our third son was prenatally diagnosed with spina bifida and hydrocephalus. And what that means is he was born with an open hole in his back. So it's similar to like a spinal cord injury, and there's damage to the nerves and all of that. And hydrocephalus is extra fluid in the brain. So we knew he would have to have 2 surgeries the very first day or week of his life, which he did. But what's interesting about our journey is I always like to talk about how we took a road less traveled. And that is because after he was about 2.5 weeks old, he went into respiratory failure. So I noticed he was having some breathing problems, swallowing. He had really severe reflux. So I took him back to the hospital. My husband and I did in the ER. It's kind of funny looking back because it didn't really dawn on me to go to the ER. Like I just I wasn't sure what to do with all of the issues that he was having. And we went in and they admitted him. We ended up spending the next 64 days in the hospital. 30 of those days was in the pediatric intensive care unit. And basically he was just fighting for his life. They would put him on a CPAP mask to help him breathe. And then they would try to take him off just to like nasal cannula of oxygen. And he would start to cry and he would code and he would turn blue and all of that. And so finally the doctors came to us and said, we really need to think about doing surgery for trach, which we did. He already had a nasal feeding tube at this point. So he had another surgery for a feeding tube. Anyway, when we brought him home, he was medically fragile on a ventilator with a trach 24/7 with about 16 hours a day of nursing care in our home. And at the time, our older boys were 2 and 3.5. So we had 3 kids, 3 and under.
Oh my gosh.
And then this medically fragile baby. And in the last 15 plus years, he's been through about 60 surgeries. We've had seizures and bowel obstruction surgeries and shunt problems, a lot of scoliosis, back issues. But we have seen the inside of our hospital here in Columbus more than, most people do. So,
yeah. Definitely. It's like I make a joke when we go to the hospital when people are trying to tell us like where to go. And I'm like, oh, we're frequent flyers. We got it. And it's no one really ever wants that badge of honor, if you will. Well, it's funny. Even though each of us have our own story that causes people to really pause when they hear it, it doesn't disregard when you hear somebody's story like yours of just the awe of, wow, like that's a lot. And so I'm really present to like, that's a lot. And the first thing that I'd love to look at is how you care for yourself. So I imagine in the early days it was survival, but you've now done 15 years of this. And I'm really interested in kind of how you tended to your heart, especially. Because I think most of us are actually pretty good at surviving it, which is like the brain part of like just armoring through. I don't know if that's a word, but we're going to go with it. Armoring through. And yet I think what can be lost is our hearts. I'd love to hear what comes up in terms of caring for your heart.
So first of all, I feel like that journey probably started when our son was 5. And that was after just like an unexpected hospital stay. He had been in about 5 days. I think we had to call the ambulance because he was just unresponsive, just kind of staring off into space. I wasn't sure if he was having seizures or what was going on. And I remember getting out of the hospital. We didn't really have any answers. And, life just continued to go on. And I was in a situation where I just kind of went off on somebody because they just weren't being very understanding about the situation we were in and what was just happening. And I remember just feeling like I have a really strong faith. God was just telling me, you're grieving. And these are the parts of the grieving cycle: denial, anger, all those pieces. And this is going to be an ongoing part of your journey. You are always going to have grief and be living somewhere in the grieving cycle. So that was extremely eye-opening, because I remember thinking, well, grief was definitely part of the beginning with the prenatal diagnosis and just all that we had to deal with. I was a high-risk pregnancy after that. But I didn't realize that it's an ongoing part of the journey. So that's probably the first awareness that I had, that I needed to tend to my grief and tend to my heart. Secondly, it's just been probably in the last couple of years, I'm realizing how important it is to dive into story and
oh yeah, we talked about this. Yeah.
Yeah. And to share your story with others, and to think about your story of origin and why it is that you believe the way that you believe, why it is that you think the way that you think, because, even just the traumas that I've had throughout our journey with Toby have caused me to believe certain things or act in certain ways, because you're just in survival and you just keep going. And I think it's really important to bless the ways that we survive, because I think God gives us those survival modes and coping mechanisms and things like that. I think a lot of times we just want to hold so much contempt and almost anger towards how we deal with emergency and grief and trauma. But those are the things that in actuality we need to bless. Now, we shouldn't continue in them, but
I was going to say, I'm going to pause you just to make sure we break that down for listeners that might not be familiar with that language.
Sure.
So when you say bless the way we survive, would that be something like thanking the survival mechanisms that we have that got us through and just really honoring them for what they are? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah. And I think it's also like, for instance, I can look back at how naive I was when my son was in the ICU, for instance, and really just being very angry at her, or just feeling a lot of contempt for how I dealt with that and how I didn't really have an awareness of what life was going to look like after that. To bless how I was in that situation is to be not necessarily thankful, but just to not be angry at her because she was naive in those moments. And also to understand that coming out of that, I may have picked up the survival mode of, oh, I have to be in control all the time, right? And still blessing that, because that has helped my son survive, but also understanding that that's not a way to always live. Does that make sense?
For sure. I think I even get a little tripped up on the word bless. I'm used to using it in a different context, but I think it's such an important principle. I really want to make sure people understand, because I think it's really interesting. I was working with a client. They were sharing that they didn't want to journal anymore because they didn't want to, when they look back at their old journal, they just can't stand who they were. And I think what you're saying in this concept is like looking back at who you were and like fully loving and accepting and honoring the place that you were at that time. And like you said, like we don't necessarily want to stay there forever. Like we can love it, but also recognize it wasn't where we wanted to stay. Does that sound like it's actually on the same tune of what you're saying as well?
Yeah, definitely. And like one of the things just about my personality is I tend to be I can sometimes lean easily into the grief and sadness and like the tears, because I tend to just be a very emotional person. Well, for years, I have felt that I was too emotional, that I was such a baby. I've had that spoken over me in the past. And instead, I'm learning that my emotion and tenderness is what makes me me. Now, it doesn't mean that I, in an emergency situation with my son, completely fall apart, right? But that there is a place for that tenderness and that emotion, and learning to be content with how I'm wired and how I'm going to deal with those situations.
Yeah. And this loops back to what you were saying about your story, right? So this is where it sounds like you've restoried it. You've looked at this idea of you being emotional and like the story of that being too emotional. And it sounds like you have a new story that actually has your emotions be part of your uniqueness and your beauty and like how God created you. We'll have to have another podcast about story because I don't think we can fit all the things in today. But anything else to add before we kind of go into another topic as far as tending to yourself? And so I'm saying tending to your heart, but really just all the things as far as how you cared for yourself through this entire journey.
So I think I want to preface this with, we've been fortunate enough, and there's been a downside too, to have nursing. And so that has allowed me some time and space to tend to myself. So in the early days, there were two things that helped me tend to myself. One was a support group that a friend and I started. We had kids that didn't fit in the boxes of their diagnoses. And so we started a support group for moms of medically complex children. And we would get together once a month and grab coffee or grab dessert or something. And we were kind of all in the same area. All of our kids were treated at the same hospital. And that was very soul tending to me because we could all relate on some level. We had something in common, even though our kids all looked very different. And so I think that's one part of soul tending is to find your community. And the second way that I found to tending to my soul was actually finding some purpose in my son's diagnosis. And what ended up happening was when my son was probably about 20 months old, I went back to our local hospital and I started volunteering. And our hospital is awesome in the fact that they want families to be involved. They have different committees. The committee that I spent the most time on, about 13 years, was actually a group called Family as Faculty. And what we did was we would share our stories, going back to story again, to new employee orientation. And we would talk about our good experiences that we had at the hospital and our bad, and how the bad could have been made better. So talking about family-centered care from the family perspective, which basically just means that those you're interacting with, doctors, therapists, nurses, are treating you and have a little bit of an idea what it's like to live in your shoes. And again, that was very soul nurturing for me, outside of, trying to keep, exercise and journaling and things like that too. But those were two things that have really helped me, because especially teaching, they kind of called it teaching at the hospital, because I had to process enough of our own journey to be able to speak about it in a way that wasn't going to show a lot of complaining and contempt. And again, it's not like we couldn't share some of the stories of mistakes and things that had gone wrong in the hospital, but we wanted to focus on, yes, this happened, but this is how it could have been better. This is how this nurse could have treated the situation. Instead of treating our child like every other patient, she could have asked a good question or something like that.
I imagine that volunteer piece, I'm so glad you shared that, because I think it sounds like you had to process, which is in and of itself work, but you could be there. You didn't have to do a lot of outside stuff. You could actually just give your experience and your story. But I know a lot of the experiences that I'm sure a lot of us will relate to at the hospital is that you feel powerless and like you don't have the ability to control what's happening, and especially when it's not good, right?
Yeah.
That this opportunity to literally give feedback and be part of the improvement probably really helped shift your relationship in a way that not just served the hospital, it probably really served you to help you get out of that victim or that stuck place with the hospital. So that's it's almost like it's a back door into actually shifting your paradigm.
Yeah, it did. And I felt like it helped me to create a safer place for other families. It felt like our situation that we had was not without purpose, because I had the ability to go back and help other families, and since have even been able to just help families navigate the hospital in our area. If they have questions about things or whatever, it felt like there was value to our situation, and that I could go back and advocate and do something about it. I wasn't powerless. Yeah.
Yeah, which is amazing. Yeah, you're giving me some ideas for future projects that I want to do, but I'm going to side note those, and I want to shift gears again, and I want to tap into your experience with nursing care.
Yeah.
So this is a topic that comes up often with my clients and just in conversations here on the podcast, because there's the dark side and the light side of having home care. So I would love just to start off with, what's your experience? Share a little bit there, and then we'll kind of dig into it a little bit.
Sure. So we have been fortunate enough that for the most part, we've had a good experience with nursing. Now, I can tell you that we've probably been through about 50 nurses in the last 15 years. I tried to list them out one day, and the list, I couldn't remember all the names of people who have been in and out of our house. So one of the things that I think is really important with nursing, and even if your agency isn't doing this, I think you need to stress this and try to make this a part of your experience, is we would always screen whoever was coming out. So we are fortunate enough that one of our agencies that we use is through our hospital. So they understand the value of family-centered care, even in the home setting. And what that means is they will tell me, hey, I have a nurse for you. We're going to do a meet and greet. So they would come out, and then I could tell them yay or nay, whether, she clicked or whether she didn't, or I say she, because mostly they were women through the years. And the other part of that too was just setting expectations. And in the very beginning, the nurse taught me a lot. I mean, I can remember our very first nurse and who she was, and she was amazing, and she taught me so much. But as the years went by, it was me teaching the nurses, right, about our son. And because as if you've met one child with spina bifida, you've met one child with spina bifida, and it's the same for every diagnosis. Like, we're all unique individuals in every diagnosis that's there. So that was really important. And then also, one of the things that I've always tried to do is have a list of like house rules.
Mm-hmm.
So I think our agency started this years ago, but it's just like where to park, where to put your belongings, how to interact with the other children in the home, and just to sort of set those expectations. And I'm an over communicator. I used to be a teacher. It's really important to me that the guidelines are very clear and that they know what's going on. And what's interesting is we actually just had a new nurse come in a few weeks ago, because there's nursing shortages, and we're actually having that same problem right now in home care. And I decided to type up a letter to these new nurses coming in, because now we've been on this journey for 15 years. And honestly, I can tell the minute a nurse walks in the door, whether she's going to be a good fit or not. If she doesn't take off her shoes and she tries to mother my son, it's not going to be a good fit. And it's also being aware of yourself too, and what is important to you. So one of the things that's really important to me is that the nurse can be there when my son needs things, but then kind of fade into the background when we're trying to do family time. And that's just always been an important part of our nursing journey. And so I think it's important for you to define what is important to you and what you need and want. I am definitely a control freak, and I'm the one calling the doctors. I'm the one, doing the medications and things like that. I don't really want the nurse doing that kind of stuff, but other people may prefer that. So I think it's just setting those clear expectations and having that good communication. So back to this new nurse that came in, I just kind of wrote her a letter and just said, hey, we're 15 years into this journey, and this is just a little bit about our family. And we love you being here, but just so you know, it's going to take us a while to get used to you, because, what happens is our son gets attached to these nurses and then they leave. And cognitively, my son's pretty much developmentally around 15. He's, give or take a few months, or just depends on the situation. Like he's really above his age level for medical stuff, but he might be a little bit behind. But he thinks they're all his friends. And when they leave, it's so difficult for him. So that's probably been one of the downsides, is just that the level that you get attached to somebody and then they leave and he doesn't understand why, or he takes it personally because he thinks it's him. So that's been a little bit about nursing.
You have a lot of wisdom here, and thank you so much for sharing it. Yeah, and just thinking about endings, and we'll kind of go back into some things I want to break down with nursing. My son had the hardest time ending radiation because of the positive impact one of his technicians had on him. He just really met him in a place where he was very vulnerable and made him feel safe. Yeah. And so it's so mind-boggling as an adult to be like, what? You don't want to end radiation? But then when you understand the deeper reasoning, then you totally understand. Oh, that makes so much sense. So with the nursing, I love that you hit on this idea of house rules, because I have had hired home help, right? So, and yours is essentially hired too. You're just not paying for it. Right. And mine wasn't nursing care. Mine was a in-home call her a nanny, but really more of a house manager, in the sense that she was doing all care for kids, cooking, food prep, picking up my kids and all that kind of stuff. She's also the editor of this podcast. So Alex, I love you.
That's awesome.
So I learned too along the way, right? Like, did not have 50, I had nowhere close to 50, but you learn, one, how hard it is to manage someone so close to your home. Right. Yes. I had the privilege of managing people in the workplace. And so what finally clicked for me is like, oh, like I'm their manager. It just happens to be their place of employment is my home. Yeah. So really kind of, of course I geek out on like leadership stuff and all the things. And so when you really apply all the components of good leadership, good managing, all the things, and then apply it to having an in-home care provider, it helps answer some of the questions that become difficult questions to answer, because I think that sometimes when this person's in her home, what my clients do is like forget that they actually have agency over what happens, and they call the shots. I'm curious because this point about fading into the background, I can see that being something that of course you desired. And it sounds like you evolved to kind of learn that and have words to articulate that. How did you create that? Because that takes a higher level of emotional intelligence to, one, for you to know it, but then for someone to be able to actually deliver, right? To know when to come in and know when to go back. So how did you, as the leader in this circumstance, how did you create that?
So I think in some ways it happened organically, just as my son grew and became a little bit less medically fragile. So through the years, when he was around 3, he got off the ventilator during the day and he was still on it at night. And so it just meant a nurse didn't have to be hovering, around him. And part of it too was creating a space in our home. And again, I know not everyone has this flexibility, this ability to do this, but finding a space in our home where they can kind of have an office or just a spot. At our old house, we lived in a tiny little house when he was first born, and it just happened to be, kind of at the kitchen table. We didn't really have a dining room. It was a kitchen and a dining room all in one, this tiny house we lived in. Now it's a guest bedroom where, we have guests. Obviously they kind of have to move out to the open area. Our houses were open because my son's in a wheelchair. So sometimes it is kind of hard to find that space. And then I think also it was just, so about 9-10 years ago, we brought our older 2 kids home to homeschool. And I think that kind of was part of it too, of just, I'm home all the time. And again, I know not everyone has the same situation. I understand that. So I know this may not apply to everybody, but I would just kind of say, hey, we're going to do our morning time together. I read books to my kids and we would kind of start our day and do all these little things that we do in the morning that are important to us. Do you mind if you could just sit in his room for this time and allow us just to have our privacy? So I will tell you, like, conflict, and that's not my strength. Like, I will run from it. And I can't say there was a lot of conflict, but even sometimes just expressing, hey, can you please just go sit in his room for a little while? We need to have this time alone. That can be really hard to express what you need and want. And I just have had to do that because we needed to have time. I need to have time with my other kids and have time alone and things like that. It did grow a little bit organically. And then I think it's just been me learning how to express my wishes and find ways, to put them in a spot when he doesn't need them, that they can just sit and be and things like that. But then, we've also nurses have gone to the pool with us. Like, I've told nurses, hey, this day I need you to wear your swimsuit because we're going to go take, our son to the water park. And even though he can't do the slides, he can do the lazy river, and you're just going to go with us. And thankfully, we've had nurses who've been pretty flexible. And again, it's kind of an upfront expectation that I've tried to set. Like, during the summer, we try to go do things. We try to be active and things like that. And so if you don't want to be a part of that, then this probably isn't the home for you. And a lot of times I try to set those expectations when they first walk in the door with that meet and greet. And I will even tell them, like, we're a family of faith and we talk about the Bible and things like that. And if this is not a home for you where that you're going to be comfortable around that, then this might not be the place for you. So I will tell you, probably one of the hardest parts of this has been parenting in front of people watching you.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It creates a high level of integrity. You literally have somebody watching you.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be difficult. I like to just tell myself my neighbors can hear me yelling at my kids. So I try to keep it under control that way. I want to go back to this really beautiful example of you creating what you needed. And that's just the simple sentence, hey, I need my privacy right now. Can you go into the other room? When you said that, I was like, that's brilliant. And you also spoke to and it's hard to say. It's so hard to say because I'm sure it's like we're wanting to manage other people's feelings too, and like making sure that the nurse doesn't feel rejected and understands all the things, right?
Yeah.
And so we could go into a whole episode actually on peace, but we're going to keep it short today. But I just want to point that out, that you actually being responsible for creating what you needed,
yes,
right? Which was privacy.
Yes.
Was actually the beginning of it. And then going to create it was the easier part. But if you had not been so clear on what you wanted and needed, it would have been much more wonky. And that's when it starts to feel really fuzzy for people. And they're like, you don't like me. You're like, no, I do. I just want to be alone too. But you being really clear about what you needed, it's just a really good example. And so yay. And thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So I heard you mention wheelchair, and I now have a legitimate wheelchair for my child. I feel like we've moved up a level as far as our legitimate looking disabilities, which is a funny thing to say out loud. But he had a wheelchair that I had just bought in secondhand, and now he has a custom wheelchair. And actually, I think, wow, people are going to think we're like legit disabled now. This is awesome. Like, they won't wonder anymore. They'll just say, oh, that child's disabled. But he's a sometime wheelchair user. And you had shared with me that accepting that your son would be a full-time wheelchair user and that walking would no longer be a goal was a really hard process for you. And I'd love for you just to share, maybe just give us a little bit of like, what was your experience? What did you notice? What did you have to restory? What story did you have to step into to actually accept that piece?
Sure. So I think one of the big things around the diagnosis of spina bifida is, does your child walk, or will they be able to walk? And because depending on where the hole is on the spinal cord, some kids walk with just ankle braces. some kids don't even have braces. They call it the lesion is so low that they don't even need that. Or you have kids who have walkers or forearm crutches. So it just really runs such a span. So when you know your child's going to be born with spina bifida, it's like the first thing that you're thinking about and talking about after, obviously the shock and everything. And so I always wanted him to walk. And I can remember we were doing physical therapy pretty much from the time, when he went home around 3 months old. So from the time he was about 3 months old, and I know he even had therapy in the hospital. Once he was stable, we started working on walking. And I can remember he needed braces that were called HKAFOs, which basically means they went from the hip all the way down to his ankle. And he doesn't have a lot of movement below the hip. So all the movement to walk is coming from the hip and basically kind of swinging through on a walker. And I remember even having to fight with a physical medicine doctor to write a script for those braces because she was like, well, he's hooked up to a ventilator. He's never going to walk. And, it was just advocating for all of that. And I think probably the story that I was telling myself is that your value comes because you can walk and you can overcome this disability, and I think some of the story too was just that I just wanted him to have regular spina bifida and not all these extra things like a trach and suctioning and a feeding tube and being hooked up to a feeding pump 20 hours a day and not being able to speak because you have a trach. He didn't start saying mama until he was about 30 months old. So there were just so many obstacles to overcome in so many ways. I think I was just trying to make him normal, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes so much sense. And I just thank you for putting words to it because I think you're speaking to, I think, what every mother in your shoes knows or similar shoes, right?
Yeah.
And I think putting words to it is really valuable. So thank you.
Yeah. And so finally, when he was, I think he was about 5, he started to have just a really severe curve to his spine. We tried bracing for a while and it just wasn't working. And finally they said, you know what, we're going to have to do surgery to put these rods in called Vector, VEPTR. It stands, it's an acronym for expandable prosthetic titanium rib, basically. And what they are is they're ribs that go from rib to rib and rib to pelvis. And about every 6 months, we have to grow these to make them bigger. And he was 5 when he had that surgery. And I remember the orthopedic surgeon looking at me and telling me he can't walk anymore. It's just, he's expending so much energy for how difficult it is. And then with the rods, it's going to make it even more difficult. And just the benefits, are not going to outweigh the risks and the effort and all of that. And I remember just bawling my eyes out in that appointment. After that appointment, I've already mentioned how teary I can be. I get teary just talking about it. But I think the narrative that I had to rewrite was that my son had worth and value, even in a wheelchair. So we were at Disney. My husband and I were at Disney in February without the kids. And there was a t-shirt that had like BB-8 on it or something. And it says role model, ROLL. And I bought it for him because, this is how we roll is with his wheelchair. And I hate the term wheelchair bound. And I know there's, everybody has different feelings about different terms, and I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes or offend anyone, but my son is not bound by his wheelchair. His wheelchair has allowed him to access life. He just started trying adaptive tennis, and his wheelchair has been a source of great accessibility for him. And for me, it was rewriting the narrative that my son is not normal. No, he is, he's normal for who he needs to be. And no matter if the world is going to look at him as disabled or feel pity because he can't walk. And sometimes he feels even pity for himself, which I totally honor and grieve with him alongside that, because he's at that age where he really is kind of angry about his diagnosis and his disability.
Yeah.
But also understanding that his value doesn't come with what he does or the fact that he can walk. His worth and value is because he's a created being, created by God, and he's an amazing kid. And I so much want people to see him for his personhood and his sense of humor and all the things. I always say he's a kid with spina bifida. He's not the spina bifida kid, because it is a part of who he is. And it certainly has guided a lot of our lives, but it doesn't define completely, who he is.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And thank you for sharing the behind the scenes of the journey. What I think is really remarkable about this, and this is the thing I want moms really to catch on to, is that you had your own journey. Prior to being a mom of a child with disabilities, I didn't really have a lot of connection to anybody with a disability. I mean, yes, in some senses of like learning disabilities, but to have major disabilities that are like apparent to me, I did not have that. And so I had to come through my own journey of even using the word disabled. And you spoke to it really beautifully of recognizing that we had our stories of what it meant to be disabled, and they weren't good stories.
Right.
Right? Like nobody was telling like good stories about any of these things, but you were able to become aware and rewrite these stories so that you've recognized that his value and his worth doesn't come from any of these outside things like a chair or not a chair. And this is actually, I think, one of the things that the world can learn from anybody, but particularly with children or people with disabilities, is really questioning the value of a human. And it's, in my opinion, it's just because they're a human.
Yeah.
There's no qualifier. And so you went through this journey and you got so clear on his value, which I think this is the thing I want all the moms to hear, is the critical piece in you parenting him and you being the stand for possibility that he sees his value irregardless of this disabilities. You can kind of be that opening for him.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, there's a lot to grieve. I mean, my son's just a few years behind yours, and the questions are coming as far as, so I'm looking around, and kind of seems like I got gypped.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm like, yeah, I'm right there with you, buddy. Like, this is not fair. Right? But also not questioning in our faith, because we share a faith, not questioning God's goodness as a result of these horrible disabilities. But really being able to just be there in the grief and to process all that there is there. Yeah. Anyhow, any thoughts or anything to add to that?
Well, and I think I've just been learning lately that so much of life is not either or. We kind of talked about this when I interviewed you for our podcast. It is the both and. It's holding the grief and the sorrow and even the anger. Like, I'm trying to learn how to be present with him in his grieving, because it's happening much later than my own, and it looks much different than my own, because his awareness has been at a different timeline than mine. And there are times that I am tempted to just push past it or give him platitudes or just or want to fix it for him. And I can't do all of that. But at the same time, I also don't want him to sit in a place too long of self-pity to where he sinks into depression and, self-loathing. And again, I think it's teaching him and modeling for him his value and his worth is not based on what he can do, whether he can climb the stairs and go down a water slide or play basketball in the same way that his two older brothers do. But he has value and worth because he is human, like you said.
Yeah, well, I think you spoke to these very important pieces about, firstly, you processing your feelings about it. And then secondly, creating the space or giving him the space to process his own. And I think this is interesting, actually. I find that as a mother, when we see our child, let's just say hurting, let's say that.
Yeah.
We're desperate to make it go away and to fix it. I think that's just like our hearts. Of course, right?
Yeah.
But I think this is the place, and I'm actively doing this work as well, is to actually pull back and recognize them hurting is actually, stay with me here, valuable to them.
Yeah.
If they don't go through that, they'll literally get stuck, suppressing, right? And stuffing.
Yeah.
So it's actually valuable for them to like process through the hurt. You would never expect any human to never hurt, right? But when your own child is doing it right in front of your eyes, we just have this natural instinct to like want to make it stop.
Yeah.
Right. And this is going to be incrementally harder for those of us that haven't learned to process and accept all of our own emotions for ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. So if you find yourself having a really difficult time with this piece, it's going to be a red flag that this is the work for you to do first before you expect your child to do it. Anything to add as far as what you've had to learn about yourself in terms of creating space for your processing and for your emotional journey?
I think I would just echo what you said. I'm grateful in some ways that my own experience with learning about grief happened around the time that he was 5, and understanding that it is the grieving cycle is an ongoing part of the journey of being a mom of a child who has a disability. Now, I can't speak to if and when he's ever out of the house. Maybe it gets a little bit easier, but it's just a cycle that is constantly, you're kind of going round and round on it because, right now, all of my son's friends are getting their driving permits. And I'm seeing these moms posting on Facebook, and it breaks my heart because if and when my son can ever drive, we've had to have some hard conversations about you may not drive when your friends are driving. You may not graduate from high school when your friends graduate from high school. And what does that look like when a new set of friends come through? Or, just all of those things. So I think me being aware of how my body holds sadness and how my body holds grief and what that looks like for me has been helpful for me to also teach my son, this is what it looks like. It's okay to feel how you're feeling. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to question God and wrestle with these feelings and wrestle with these emotions, and to see a counselor and to have a safe place to process this information and all of that. And one of the big things I had to overcome with that was me coming to terms that I wasn't a failure as a mom because my son needed to have somebody else, a professional, come in and help him process his big emotions and his anger and all of that, the sadness and sorrow over, his awareness and things and how his life is different than other kids his age. So that was a huge hurdle for me personally, that I felt like I should be the one that can do all of this. I should be the one that can fix this for you. If I can't fix it for you, I can be the one that can listen and help you process all this. And the truth is I tried to be a really good listener, but I'm not a failure as a mom. I'm not a failure as a person, as a wife, because we need somebody else to help us to process through your big feelings. And
yes, wholeheartedly. Yes. And it's really interesting. So actually my son and I do therapy together, mostly to keep him on track.
It's funny because I've been in therapy with my son too. Like we've just done it together too. Yeah. It's like, he'll just kind of go off on this tangent. And I'm like, oh no, let's bring you back in.
And to have someone else just help us navigate it. Like it's been so helpful. I feel like I get more feedback in our sessions than he does, which is perfect. And he's come a long way. But it's funny too, because there was one time we got on and we always do like a debrief afterwards. And she was like, yeah, you two are in cahoots on something. And basically, like, she was calling me out, but in a nice way, right? And it was, I think, right before a surgery. So we were both escalated, right? We were both in our own process. And she's like, you guys are like feeding off of each other. Like, again, just noticing, right? And it was really interesting to be like, oh my gosh, like, she's so right. Like, we're both hovering above the emotion because we're scared out of our minds.
Yeah.
So valuable to have someone point that out. I feel like I get more feedback in our sessions than he does, which is perfect. And the reason I'm sharing any of that is because we as mothers are too close, right?
Yeah.
The therapist is, or coach, right? This can be in different applications. I think they can both do something similar, right? One, you don't have, what did they say, a dog in the race. You can see things differently than when you do. And so them having this very different perspective can offer different insight that we might be totally unaware of. Yeah, definitely you're not a failure. And if anything, I think it's, admitting that you need help is, I think, a very powerful and brave and honorable choice. And I know that yet still there's stigma, I think, about a lot of things. And so this is probably when we still have like little bits and pieces of a disempowering story about what it looks like to be these days.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I'm so glad we kind of looped back to talking a little bit more about grief. And thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing your journey, the evolution that you have undergone. And as we wrap up this episode, is there anything on your heart that you want to share before we finish up?
I think I would just encourage your listeners to, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, but it just kind of is coming to the forefront of my mind, is don't stuff the feelings down. I know there's a time for that when you're in survival mode or you're having to make quick decisions. And trust me, we had to call the squad one time from Disney, like, because my son was in jump failure and he was completely out of it. And I have had to make some crazy life saving decisions about our son. And we just have been in a lot of, medical emergency moments. So I understand that, you have to stuff down those things. And like you said, armor up in order to make these choices. But when they come back around, there's a reason why they're coming back around. There's a reason why you just lashed out at the barista at Starbucks because she got your order wrong. Probably it's linked to something that you haven't processed, a story that you have not processed or grieved. And I just think that it's just so important. And I think the other thing too, just lastly, is one of the things I've learned about the grieving cycle is it's not like you're in one stage and you move to the next stage. You can feel and be in denial and have anger and sorrow all at the same time and still be coping, right? Like it's that both and idea. They're just recently I'm like, okay, we probably need to go get this checked on you, because you've been complaining about this pain for several weeks. But I was kind of in denial because if we call the doctor, it means all these appointments and tests and things like that. So I guess that's just understanding that everything's not going to be wrapped up in a nice, neat bow. And we have to learn how to function in that tension of heartache and joy and finding the beauty in the hard.
So well said. So well said. Well, Carrie, thank you so much for this conversation, for just sharing your heart, your wisdom, and your insight to my listeners. Well, we'll see you in the next episode. One more thing before we officially wrap up this show. Sometimes when I'm listening to podcasts, I have the experience of wanting more. I'm listening at the very end thinking, I sure wish that episode didn't end. I invite you, if you feel in any way the same way, I invite you to the Special Needs Mom podcast community, which is a free group that I host on Facebook, where we as a community of fellow moms who listen to this podcast and are experiencing life in similar shoes, get to talk to one another, get to share stories, get to actually interact. I hope you'll consider joining. See you over there.